Well, there's still so many different elements to examine after the trip by our president to Russia and Ukraine as part of that peace mission over the weekend. You've seen our reporter, Govan Whittles, tell you the story about what happened to him and our camera operator, Leander Tlala, and how they were treated by officials in Poland. Our camera, Leander, being pushed by a Polish customs official at one point. At the same time, of course, not clear if the peace initiative has any impact on the grounds. In other words, we need to ask if it has changed or will change the course of the conflict on the ground. Mxolisi Zondo is a researcher at Good Governance Africa. Mxolisi, good afternoon to you. A huge discussion about this peace mission. How do we even begin to assess whether it's a success or not?
Good afternoon to you and your viewers, Stephen. Thank you for having me. I think true to the nature of diplomatic and peace missions, one would have to look at this one that happened this weekend as a start of a more extensive and longer process. So from where we're sitting, looking at it, I think it was a good start. I think it's a start to a very good conversation. The fact that the conversations were able to happen this weekend and none of the African leaders were rejected by the two countries in the name of Russia and Ukraine says that there is some appetite to have these conversations with the African leaders that came through, and I think it's a positive thing that took place this weekend, despite the many challenges that the South African government and the South African envoy then faced with the two planes and evidently poor planning at the level of administration that we saw this weekend. Other than that, the conversations that took place for us signal a positive message towards a more extensive, peaceful dialogue towards ending the conflict.
Mxolisi, I mean, this debate really sort of dominates our society, doesn't it? It's interesting to watch the debate in our country and to see how so many people have different views and really strong views. Is there something about the different identities that South Africans have that this argument brings out? Does it bring out the different identities that people in our country have, in a way? A conflict very far away, but in a way between Russia and the West.
Certainly, Stephen. It does show us that we are a diverse country with many different political views and ideological views, religious views that differ and contest each other. But from how I choose to look at it, is that that's exactly what defines us. We are a very diverse country that is united even by its diversity, as we say it in our own constitution and even our own foreign policy document. But I think the takeaway from this and the debates that are happening around the situation and the visits by the African leaders from this weekend is that South Africans should ask themselves if they do believe in the ideals and principles of Ubuntu that are inscribed in our own foreign policy documents, which basically assert that I am because you are. Now, what is important in this situation? Is it that there's an attempt towards resolving the conflict, or is what important the manner in which some would rather prefer the conflict to be addressed? And I think that kind of diversity is what makes us, but our documents really pave a way forward for us to be able to think about ourselves, even as diverse as we are. When we say that we believe in a foreign policy of Ubuntu, we mean exactly this, that when there's a conflict happening so far away, it does in a way impact us at a very local level, and we can't be found folding our arms. We must contribute to the conversation in whatever way that may not be harmful to our own domestic interest. So I think that's how we look at it.
I'm going to come back to one of those points in a moment, but first the point you make about the diversity in our country, and of course that's entirely true. One of the strange things is we debate each other, but I don't know if anyone has changed their mind on Russia and Ukraine or not, or whether we just shout at each other instead.
Yeah. It's a very interesting observation, Stephen, because there's the part where we shout at each other, but the part where we must really be true to ourselves. What is it that we want as a country? And do we even see an impact of this conflict at the local level, or at the regional level as SADC, or even the African continent? Is there an impact of the conflict? And if the answer is yes, then the response should then be, do we want to see a future where the conflicts persist, or do we want to see a future where there are attempts for the conflict to be resolved? And I think this weekend really does signal an appetite, at least from the African leaders and the warring parties, that there is an appetite to put an end to the conflicts. And I think even at the local level, South Africans and political parties within the South African context should think carefully about what it is that they see as the outcome of these conflicts as we see it today.
You made the point about it is within Ubuntu. You made the point looking at our foreign policy documents that we should, I presume you're heading in this way, and Mxolisi, I don't want to speak for you, that we want the war to end. There's another debate which this sort of feeds into, which is whether President Ramaphosa should be looking at something that's happening very far away or not. And yet, of course, you're entirely correct, and it would also be in our national interest to end the conflict, because while we have such big problems at home that he needs to attend to, our problems might be a bit easier if food prices were lower because this conflict ended.
Certainly, Stephen. It's a correct conversation to have, whether or not the president should focus on what happens locally or look so far away. But we can't ignore the fact that what happens at the local level does, in fact, affect what happens at the foreign level. And what happens outside does also influence what happens in the South African context. All of the challenges that we're facing now from just the past 18 months or so, be it the inflation, rising of inflation, the increased price of a food basket, the increase of fuel prices, all of those are in a way impacted by this conflict that we're thinking about and talking about today. So I think one of the reasons why you even have a Department of International Relations, which is DECO, is the fact that you can't ignore what happens outside and only focus on what happens domestically, because in a way there is a direct impact that you find at that level. And so I think the attention that we're seeing now from our president is a correct one. In fact, we did need more messaging from the president, because if you look at this conflict, there's been mixed conversations and a lack of a proper articulation of what it is that is our foreign policy in this regard. And I think having President Ramaphosa, for one, speaking on behalf of the South African government and South African people, does show us that we are focused on what is happening at the local level and also focused on what is happening at the international level. And it's also an opportunity for South Africa to reposition itself as a moral voice at the international stage, which is something that we have been lacking for quite a number of years. For the past decade or so, South Africa had lost, in fact, what had been positioned as a moral voice, especially on issues of conflicts here on the African continent and abroad. So I think this is an opportunity for the South African government, of course, working with other African leaders, to reposition Africa as an agent continent that is willing to participate on what happens at the international stage, Stephen.
There's another aspect to this, which is, to my mind, this is the first time I can think of where a delegation from Africa has tried to go and make peace to help people in Europe make peace. We've seen people from Europe coming to negotiate. We've seen people coming from the West, from the United States. They even appointed someone once, Cyrus Vance, to help us negotiate peace in South Africa. They're trying to help negotiate a truce in Sudan right now. But I cannot recall an African peace mission to Europe before, and that must surely be symbolic of a changing world.
Definitely, Stephen. Some call it that the Western Europeans usually come down to Africa to deliver democracy. And I think we're seeing this now, where the African continent is participating actively in reminding the West and the Europe of what it is to be a democratic state and why we should be understanding the values of democracy. And I think Africa, the African continent, is better placed because of our own experience of conflict. Even more when you think about South Africa as we see it today, the current democratic dispensation, we have a very recent experience of conflict, and we've got so much that we can share with our European and Western counterparts. And I think this is an opportunity for us to participate and say, hey, look, we too can contribute to the conversation, and we too can assist in paving way forward as you try and redefine yourselves as the different locations within the Western Europe.
Mxolisi Zondo, thank you, a researcher at Good Governance Africa. Really do appreciate the insights.